So hi, my name is Jon Raskin. I'm here at the 3rd Annual Society for Humanistic Psychology Conference, and I'm talking with Brent Robbins, and I think we're going to be talking about phenomenology.
We're going to be talking about phenomenology and its similarities, differences with constructivist psychology a little bit, but mainly emphasizing the phenomenology part, right?
I think so.
But one of the things that you raised, right, like you said, I think is phenomenology a method? Is it a science?
Mm-hmm.
And how did you frame the question?
Well, a lot of it came out of my not having a feeling like I had a full understanding of exactly what one does,
right,
when one does phenomenological investigation, and then also kind of wondering about how does it differ from other kinds of investigation that might not necessarily call themselves scientific investigation.
Right.
So like if somebody's doing a series of interviews with people on a particular topic as part of maybe a documentary,
mm-hmm.
Or just having an in-depth discussion with a number of people about something, how would that be different? Because you interview a bunch of people about something and potentially kind of, based on your experience with them, come to certain conclusions about things.
Like journalism was an example.
Journalism would be one example, mm-hmm. although not like tabloid journalism, but
right.
like good
like
serious
good
journalism.
Right. It's somebody like, we were talking earlier about Robert Whitaker, who wrote Man in
mm-hmm.
America,
yeah.
who writes this very good journalistic document, Man in America, about the history of psychiatry and connecting the dots,
right.
getting the facts and then reporting them in some systematic and meaningful way. That's journalism, not science. How is phenomenology science as opposed to journalism?
Because the idea being that you, in some ways, you use your experience and interpretation mm-hmm. of what you learn from interacting with somebody.
Right. Well, these are excellent questions. So let's kind of back up to the original question, which is phenomenology? What does it mean to do phenomenology? We'll start off. Really, phenomenology has two important moments, two separable moments, where the first part is what's called the phenomenological reduction. And in the phenomenological reduction, what's being done is sometimes it's called a bracketing, or it's the epoche, where one attempts right. to loosen or set aside or set in brackets mm-hmm. one's assumptions or presuppositions right. or categories of mm-hmm. understanding. Not necessarily getting rid of them, because that's not possible. Mm-hmm. There's no such thing as a complete reduction. But loosen them enough that one can begin to entertain other ways mm-hmm. of understanding right. the world. So that's the first part. So once the purpose of that is ultimately to get to the second moment mm-hmm. in the phenomenological method, which is the phenomenological reduction is the first part, and then the second part is called the eidetic reduction. And eidetic comes from the word eidos, which means essence or ideal. Think of like Plato's essences. And but in phenomenology, what's different in phenomenological essences, at least in existential phenomenology, is rather than essences being something that is sort of exists in the heavens somewhere and everything in existence is sort of a pale imitation of those essences. Essences are emergent from the ambiguities of lived realities, and they approximate in some way those lived experiences, but never completely. So there's always other ways of construing, maybe constructivists would put it, other ways of structuring how we understand something. So the second part, the eidetic reduction, is about developing an emergent essence out of the description of the life world, description of what we're examining. And then it's a situated structural description mm-hmm. because there's a sense in which it's not a complete or finished mm-hmm. essence, that there might be other ways of construing or constructing what it is we're studying.
So essences can change.
So essences can change.
So there's no essential essence to essences.
Exactly.
Right?
Right. They're sort of like non-essential essences.
Mm-hmm. But then in some ways, it's kind of interesting, but why even call them essences then? If the idea is that you're kind of coming up with a situated understanding mm-hmm. based on sort of openness to experience, and those can potentially change it. There's something confusing because I think a lot of people think of essences as, in this Platonic way, as these sort of firm, definitive, unchangeable kinds of things. And so this is somewhat different than that. And even some of the phenomenologists I've heard talk about this don't seem to frame it the way you're framing it right now. They seem to think that somehow with this reduction we are getting at something that's sort of irreducible and permanent and enduring. I don't know if they mean that, but sometimes that's the impression that I get.
Well, I think that that there's things that you might get at that are, let's go back to Heidegger, right, for example, and in his existential analytic in Being and Time, where he's attempting to understand the basic structures of human being, right? So the idea would be that some of the fundamental structures or the existential givens of existence are time, time, space, sociality, right, and those and language, and being towards death. Those kinds of things would be certain existential givens that would be, universal. That any human being would have these certain structures. But those different givens vary from culture to culture. So, and there's a way in which you can understand Heidegger's existential analytic as revealing a kind of essence. But it's not an essence in a Platonic sense. It's an essence in that it's emergent out of an attempt to grapple with everyday existence. But the claim is that you're getting at something that's not arbitrary. You're getting at something that is that could be framed in a different way. That could be set to language in a different way, and yet is getting at something essential in the sense that it has ontological validity.
Is it an essential aspect of the world, or is it an essential aspect of the person's meaning process? That is the person, because of how they're built as a person and how they're structured biologically, psychologically, is that what gives rise to this? Or is it primarily that somehow they're bracketing that out and removing that, not being influenced by these sort of biases and how they're built and structured, and getting at something in the world, and even if they're not getting at it in some perfectly God's eye view kind of way, they're kind of getting at that thing.
Well, they would say the question you're raising is this attempt to grapple with, is this sort of my construction, or is this something that's out there in the world? That question is itself a kind of it's something that in our everyday engagement is usually a question that we don't raise, right? It's like that when when I'm driving around, on the highway somewhere, and we hit the ice patch like we did earlier today and got in a little car accident. At that moment, we weren't going, is that ice patch, my meaning construction, or is it, we did that, as you mentioned, the glass. If somebody throws a glass at your head, you're not going, gee, is that glass, is that glass just confetti falling from the ceiling, or is it, you're not going to, explore your construction. You're going to get the hell out of the way of the glass as fast as you can, or, So I think in that same, in our everyday engagement with things, according to Heidegger, we fall into the world, right? And in our fallenness, we turn away from what Heidegger calls an authentic mode of being. Authenticity doesn't mean like a better way of being in the world. For him it means it's better only in the sense that it gets you closer to the question he's interested in, which is understanding what it means to be. But he's saying if you want to understand being, you have to understand the being who asked that question.